Clark Duncan, and I serve as a Senior Vice President for Economic Development at the Asheville Area Chamber and the Economic Development Coalition. Thank you for being here today. I have to start really with an expression of appreciation for the level of collaboration between public and private sectors that we have seen throughout this crisis. It's really one of the silver linings of this trying time. And the town halls we're holding throughout this week, and believe it or not, we are doing 9 across different industry sectors, are another example of how our county and our business community have worked together in the greater interest of our residents. So let's talk real quick about what this meeting is and what it's not. This meeting is structured to give our health department the opportunity to listen, and we're grateful for that. Listening to business owners about your ideas and best practices around safety and safely conducting business as we continue to deal with the COVID-19 public health crisis. It's also a time for them to hear about things that you haven't figured out yet, whether it's where and how to obtain the right PPE, masks, sneeze shields, gloves, or how to ensure social distancing is accomplished, or any of the hundreds of other issues that many of you have encountered. And the vast majority of our manufacturers on the call today have been in business, and that stands in contrast to many of the other town hall sector meetings we've been having this week. So this meeting is definitely about sharing best practices that you've developed that you think work specifically for your industry. Many of you have shared those best practices with us over the last month, and we have communicated those back to the county. And frankly, we've been weaving them into guidance for other industry sectors. So I thank you for all of that input over the past 8 weeks now. What this meeting isn't, this is not the opportunity to lobby our health department officials about the timeline for reopening. As much as we would all love to have that crystal ball, we don't have one yet. So you're not going to come away with the meeting from this meeting with that deadline. But what we will get is a better understanding of how these decisions are being made, the data behind them. And at the Chamber and at the EDC, we're going to continue to partner with the county to communicate both the policy and the data behind the policy so that our business community, and specifically so that our manufacturers, can plan accordingly for our shared priority, which remains a safe and healthy return of the Buncombe County economy. Important to note, we are also recording these sessions, and I'm going to ask you throughout the session to make use of the chat function here on the Zoom call, which is at the bottom of the screen. That will allow you to give your input to various questions as we ask them. Critically important, because this will allow the health department to have a literal record of what you've said and a transcript. Because we're doing 9 of these this week, that written feature is going to be especially important. We can download it all and make sure that we haven't overlooked any specific input. Today, we're also going to hear from Fletcher Tove, with Public Health Emergency Preparedness Director at Buncombe County. Special thanks to Fletch. He's been on a marathon today. I think this is his 5th or 6th of these calls. And then we've also asked a couple industry reps to join us to serve as conversation starters who may spark ideas and who no doubt have had common challenges with all of you who have dialed in today. We're going to ask a series of questions as the slideshow progresses and ask you to respond in the chat feature. We hope that by doing this, we can identify any community-wide barriers that remain and that we need to address as we begin to think about the phased reopening of the Buncombe County economy, and that you, as an owner or a business leader, can continue your preparations for reopening, and so that we're all ready when that day comes. I also want to let you know that what we're hoping to collect here today are ideas, and a brainstorm, particularly with our manufacturing community, is a privilege because, frankly, we've all learned a lot in the last 8 weeks, and I hope the lessons that you all have learned and can share with us today and with our county can help influence maybe some best practices and workplace safety guidelines that other industries can emulate. And I'd personally like to thank and commend the county for providing these listening sessions and their partnership as we continue to plan for recovery. So with that, let's get started. And Fletch, I see you're on the call there. Let me throw it over to you for maybe an update on where things stand with the county and your planning.
Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. Glad you guys could join us here. I'd like to give everyone a snapshot of where we stand as a state and a county currently. So last week, Governor Cooper and Dr. Mandy Cohen laid out their metrics they're looking at to determine when's the best time to reopen the state. We're trying to emulate those metrics locally with local data to stay in line with them. They also presented us their three-pronged approach in their roadmap to a new normal. The three prongs of that are increased testing, more capacity for contact tracing, and the downward trends of the metrics I was just discussing. And then that kind of set the stage for Governor Cooper to present the framework of his phased reopening of the state, working in 3 phases. Phase 1, when we meet the criteria, is expecting to be 2 to 3 weeks long. It's some lifting of minimum restrictions, pretty light, but just kind of a slow movement. Phase 2 is where the meat of the opening happens. That's where he intends to relax his stay-home orders, relax the mass gathering guidance, and you start opening up restaurants and some other industry. And then phase 3 will be the last phase of opening into new normal, getting rid of some other restrictions. I do want to point out to everyone, though, that as we're looking at the time frame that he proposed, getting the phase 3s, if everything goes according to plan and the numbers support everything, best case scenario, phase 3 is happening sometime in July. So I just want everybody to understand this isn't a May problem. This is a solution working through May, June, July. So for everybody's awareness and mindset. This town hall should be interesting because I think manufacturing in general is probably the least impacted by any of the state or local restrictions we've seen in place. So I'm curious to see the perspective from you guys. Going forward, we have been previously more restrictive in several areas than the state's guidance. Going forward, we're really trying to be aligned with the state as they do their phased implementation. So we're going to be relaxing some restrictions over the next couple of weeks. So as the governor steps in through the phases, we could be in step with him. And I also just want to remind everyone, just for your awareness, we're very significantly aware of the impacts our decisions have, both primary and secondary impacts. And just to reassure you that as we have those, go through that decision-making process and have these discussions, that the local economy, impact on local and big business is in the forefront of those conversations as we're talking about our way forward. So just want to give you that reassurance. And that's it for my update. And I'll be around to answer questions as we continue.
Thanks, Fletch. While we've got you here at the top of the hour, I know so many of our plans locally and at the state and federal level really tie back to this concept of testing. I've heard some encouraging things lately that we anticipate the availability of testing to becoming more prevalent, even in the local marketplace. Can you talk about that for just a moment?
Right. So we're looking at the governor's three-pronged roadmap to a new normal, talking about testing, tracing, and trends. So testing, it's not where it should be, but we're continually, like day-to-day, week-to-week, seeing increased testing in Western North Carolina and in the state as more providers come online, as we get more resources, as supply chain issues get resolved. So we're slowly meeting that effort. Not as fast as we'd like to, but that's a national federal issue, but we're getting better. For the contact tracing, contact tracing is a bedrock of public health work. It always has been. So right now we have 100%, meeting 100% criteria on our contact tracing. We have people in place, so as the state develops its new platform and its training program, we can quickly scale up to meet the increased demand for contact tracing. And then trends, we're emulating the state data locally. We're looking good on some things, but across the state, some of our trends aren't where they need to be. But so locally, we're doing a really good job aggressively trying to meet those 3 measures to reopen.
Thank you. appreciate the attention to data as we navigate these questions. I'm going to pivot for a second to a couple of our guests here. And Alex, I want to start with you. Alex Matisse joins us from East Fork Pottery, because largely you saw an enormous impact, almost a complete shutdown early in March. You've started some skeletal operations. So I'd love to hear from your perspective about where you are in planning for return of workforce. What does that planning process look like for you? Any glaring questions or strategies that you're trying to understand to welcome more and more of your workforce back to the workplace?
Thanks, Clark. Yeah, we resumed some skeleton shifts about a week ago. We kind of shut everything down. We're a much smaller operation. We only ran one shift. And this actually was kind of the kick in our pants to get us going on 2 shifts. And we're trying to look at this now, actually like this being the new normal. So anticipating that there'll be a resurgence and wanting to set up everything we can now so that, I mean, we don't know what restrictions would be placed, say, in the fall, but we want to have as many protocols and procedures in place now that we just continue operating with, and really kind of settle into this as though it wasn't normal. So right now we're running shifts with just a few people, and we have everybody gets assigned a bathroom. There's sort of 2 people per bathroom. We have all the masks and the gloves and all of those protocols that we are very strict about when you're in the building. And yeah, we are trying to look at this. We're also going to be limiting the capacity in our building. So we've got our warehouse, which is our distribution, which has some extra space. We're actually moving some of our operations over there so that we can bring down the density in our location at Short McDowell. And that's something that we'll be doing. I mean, it will be actually good for business and it will allow for more continued fast growth. We're growing very quickly, so we have some unique challenges and obstacles, but we're still, our manufacturing team is only about 45, 50 people. So pretty small, but trying to look at this, like how will we continue to limit the density in our building while growing through this? And we've got plans to grow 100% this year, hopefully by December. So.
Well, I hope that even though this conversation is in advance of that phase 1, this can be an opportunity to help you continue to work on the plan for that phase reopening for East Fork. You know, this is certainly a time to plan the work and then work the plan for the next several months. And I think at the other end of the spectrum, Amy Sparks, let me call on you with our healthcare manufacturer, plastic injection molding manufacturer out in South Buncombe County, Jabil. Thanks for being here. I know you guys are probably setting production records throughout this crisis because you're producing products that go into the medical supply chain. What lessons have you all learned in terms of workplace safety and employee sort of health monitoring?
Thank you, Clark. Happy to be here this afternoon. I count us as extremely fortunate because being part of a large organization, we have had the benefit of watching what some of our China facilities went through. And so that gave us the opportunity to anticipate what some of the challenges might be. We're very fortunate to have an EH&S manager, Tom Frost, and a supply chain manager, Rhonda Ruth, who were very prepared and forward thinking, and they anticipated some of the challenges with procuring PPE, and even anticipated the temperature screening would become part of our protocol before a lot of folks were talking about it. So we were able to pretty easily implement limiting visitors, temperature screenings, We had a hard time with PPE, as a lot of folks have. In fact, we were just able to implement mandatory masks about a week ago. So we're all on mandatory masks now. We've been very fortunate that our absenteeism has not been terribly impacted. There has been some impact, but it actually, quite honestly, hasn't been as bad as I thought it would be. There was, at first, it seemed there was a big impact at first, because there was a lot that folks didn't know, and the access to testing was a real challenge for us, and it continues to be a challenge for us today.
So I hear a number of things there, Amy. For example, the zoning that Alex spoke of. I know you're able to limit employees to certain zones within the facility, therefore limiting the possibility for exposure and spread within the facility. Obviously, that assists with contact tracing should that ever become necessary within your workforce. I know you've shared with me you've also done some creative things on your return to work screening, and that's a practice that, in fact, we've talked about a lot with these other industries. Can you talk a little bit about what sort of health checks you're doing with your workforce on a daily basis?
Sure. First of all, you're correct. We do have social distancing in place, and just to minimize the exposure, one of the first things we did was anyone who could work from home was asked to work from home. So we do have a segment of the normal of the plant population, folks who would normally be here who are just not here in the building. As far as return to work, we have a decision tree that we have come up with, and the criteria for returning to work are the basic criteria is that folks have to be symptom-free for 72 hours prior to returning to work if what they're experiencing are symptoms themselves, or if it's exposure to a family member, someone living in the same house that had symptoms. The family member has to be 72 hours symptom-free before the employee can return to work. Now, in some cases, we've been able to get doctor's notes, but as everybody knows, folks have been having a hard time getting access to their doctor. So there are some cases where you know, we're having to trust that people are being honest about the 72 hours symptom-free, but they do have to check in with us physically before they can report to their work areas, and we're doing temperature screenings. We've closed down all the entrances, so there's only one entrance to the facility. That's not normally the case. There are normally multiple entrances. Everyone is having to enter and exit through the same location, and they're being screened every time they walk through the front door. So we have 24/7 temperature screening going on. Of course, we have the health assessment, the standard health assessment questionnaire for visitors or employees who have been out on an extended leave, completing the health assessment questionnaire before they come back. And then, as I said, a physical visit to HR or the EH&S manager.
Thanks for sharing that. And I see our friend Ellis Vaughn on the call. Ellis has a sample or link to a sampled health screening questionnaire. So if there are any employers on the call that would like to take a look at that, Ellis, it'd be fantastic if you could share that in the chat section for us. I think that's been really helpful and sought after through our other conversations. Amy, I was really interested to hear that you've been successful in procuring masks for your workforce. I'm going to give Fletch a minute to talk about this, because the way public health has been thinking about masks and facial coverings has evolved over the past several weeks. And there's maybe a broader definition, Fletch, that you can share.
Yeah, thanks. I'll talk about masks in a second. I just want to point out, though, that from public health standpoint, if you have the capacity and you can do the temperature test as screening, that's helpful. It's going to knock down, it's going to catch people who have that temperature, but we really encourage it that's not the sole screening effort, that's combined with a screening questionnaire. Because what we've seen is 50%, possibly more, of people with COVID-19 will not display signs of a fever. So the concern is people might have a symptom or two, but get this false sense of security because they don't have a fever. So just as you guys are looking to implement that or implemented that, please make sure you combine the temperature checks, if it's a capacity you have, with the screening questionnaire. And we've seen some businesses do like it on paper every day as people come in. We've seen some people have like a social contract that says as they clock in, they're affirming that they don't have any symptoms, that they're healthy to work that day. So just some food for thought on that. As far as masks, so when we use the term masks at public health, we're being very deliberate, talking about either like a surgical mask or an N95 respirator or N100. And then we also, in the vernacular the last couple of weeks, we've introduced the term a face covering, like a cloth face covering. So medical PPE, like surgical masks and respirators, there's still scarcity. There's still supply chain issues at a national level. So we want to try to conserve those for first responders and medical personnel. And also, if you have them, you can use them. But we're concerned that if everyone, as we start reopening, is pushing for medical type grade PPE, there's going to be another mass shortage. So what the local guidance is, the state guidance, and the CDC have been recommending is some form of cloth face covering. So that's anything from a bandana to like a t-shirt folded and with rubber bands, or to the hand stitch ones you guys have probably seen out in the community. And that has a couple advantages. One, it frees up traditional PPE for first responders and healthcare. Two, they're washable and reusable. So you could have two of those, alternate them between days and wash them, and have those last you for weeks and months through the duration of this pandemic, as opposed to a traditional PPE where a mask or respirator might last you a week or two, but it's going to lose its form and function, and we're going to have to replace that. So that's where we're at. So you hear the term, when you start hearing the term mask and face coverings used more commonly now, just understand the difference between those.
Thank you. You know, I think another question has come around regarding sanitation and making sure that we're providing as clean and healthy a work environment as possible. Can you talk at all about the strategies or guidelines that we might be able to offer employers to just continue to monitor that? I think we understand that even as other industries start to open, we're going to be living with social distancing, we're going to be living with masks, we're going to be living with sanitation standards until this thing is more under control. So what are the best go-to standards there?
Right. So I can see Ellis is ahead of us on the conversation, posting some links. She'll post the EPA link for approved disinfectants for use specifically for COVID-19, and she's also posted the some resources for cleaning practices, and that's what we're always referring to people, the CDC and EPA guidance on that. Those are your best practices and resources right there.
Great. I'd love to encourage everyone on the call to share any best practices that they have along the lines of workplace safety, whether it's your EHS guidelines or otherwise, or perhaps questions that are still sort of a question mark, for example, around PPE availability or similar things. I know early on, and it remains true, there were persistent questions, particularly in larger workplaces, which a lot of our manufacturers are, is how do you respond to a case of illness amongst an employee or staff member? I'm curious if anyone has had to respond in such a way, and how quickly you were able to sort of reduce or measure exposure at the workplace. I'm also curious, Fletch, if you've looked across the complexion and the number of cases in Buncombe County, are you able to determine even a percentage that came from a working population versus travel, or that came from other destinations or locations?
Yeah, we're not currently sharing the information about what sector these cases are coming from. But we know initially a lot of our cases were coming from people traveling outside the state, and we have them from across several different industries and sectors currently.
I think turning to the question in front of us, any resources maybe specific to your industry, your part of town, the demands on your workforce, any specific resources that are lacking that you need to continue in operations? Are you continuing to see any challenges in following the kind of guidelines that we've been talking about today?
While we're waiting for those inputs, I see Edward Abel had a question about how do we convey to people to make it, we're doing our best practices and it's safe. So we know across any sector, just because once we've opened doesn't necessarily mean the public's going to feel comfortable coming to restaurants, coming to retail. So what we've been discussing in the other town halls and what we see part of our role as the county is as we get more specific guidance from the governor of what the specifics of phase 1, 2, and 3 look like, trying to create this comprehensive, cohesive communication strategy for the county to let people know, like, hey, across the board, these are the measures that have been taken. These are, our businesses and industry being forward-leaning, being proactive with mitigating measures to give that reassurance that we're being proactive and doing those things we should be doing.
Amy, can I ask you all how you've been communicating, in this case, with your workforce? I think it would be human nature for an employee to be concerned about their own well-being. So have you been able to, communicate and air out those concerns and assure them that the guidelines you're following create a safe environment?
We have. Again, we're very lucky because we have some corporate communication resources. Our employees have been able to watch the company's response, again, as I said, since this all started in China. And we get company-wide communications about all the measures that are being taken to keep employees safe. I think our experience has been that the key is to over-communicate as much as possible. So even though we are getting company-wide communications out there that let employees know what company, or I should say Jabil-wide measures are being put in place, we've also done local communications to let folks know exactly where we stand and what stage we are at with the situation. So for example, we held right before the restrictions on gatherings were put in place, we had some town hall style meetings with our workforce, and we limited the number of people that could attend each meeting, but we let folks know what was coming, that there would be a phase 1, a phase 2, and a phase 3. We let them know exactly what actions we would start to take during each one of those phases. And then as the situation has unfolded, we're keeping folks up to date on what's going on. Now, you're absolutely right. There are employees that have, whether it's a family member at home that's at a higher risk or the employee themselves is at a higher risk, there are folks who are still concerned about coming into work. And I've just really taken the approach of talking to everybody on an individual basis. So whenever, as this has been going on, if somebody gets sick, I'm I'm talking to them personally myself. I'm making a lot of phone calls to homes. We're putting out as much communication as we can. And we're taking the conservative approach. So if someone at work is demonstrating symptoms, you know, a cough, there are lots of reasons people could have a cough right now at this time of year, but we took the approach that it's not worth the risk. If somebody I'm working right next to is coughing, I'm going to be worried about it. So we've been sending those people home and monitoring them closely.
I think as we move into this summer, you know, communications and screening becomes perhaps even more important, because perhaps the biggest change for those of you who have been in full-scale operations for the last 60 days is that your workforce is frankly just getting more exposure when they're out of work. Family members are now returning to work. There are more retail establishments that they can frequent or will be. So our need to continually communicate, you know, health and safety guidelines and screen our employees as they come in, I think becomes all the more important, especially for our manufacturing sector, because your employee might be the only person in that house that's leaving during the day, which makes for a pretty safe risk. That's going to be changing in the next few months. So I think the more we can pay attention to consistent communications, the better. You know, a consistent theme in our conversations in other town halls was around a communication campaign for residents and for visitors alike. I think there was some concern that individual businesses didn't want to feel like they had to be policing. So I think there will definitely be some thought given to PSAs and print pieces and radio and TV pieces where we can really communicate to one another as residents about this new era of physical distancing and facial covering that we're going to want to stay in as long as possible in order to balance economic recovery. I had a question for you, Fletch, that I think is particularly relevant to this group. Just scanning the faces on the call, you know, we've got Everett over in Canton, Andrew out in Weaverville. You know, workforce in manufacturing tends to be very regional in nature. Most folks on this call have workforce that probably spans 2, 3, 4, 5, even more counties. And that was really one of the first questions we got from manufacturing when the stay-home orders came out, right? And you'll recall those. Was how do we strike that balance for residents across a region? Can you talk about regional coordination with other counties, with the statewide guidance, and how do you see them coming more together?
Yes. So, you know, initially when we did our own stay home, stay safe order, we were among the first in the region. I think maybe the first in the region to do that. And we had to clarify that, you know, we're doing that for Buncombe County residents. We have no jurisdiction in Henderson County or Haywood County to enforce that. So that was an issue going on. And I think as time goes on, we've been better through our emergency operations center, through our public health director, through our emergency services, coordinating with neighboring and regional counties. But I think the biggest benefit that's happened recently is we've been clamoring for it, but we're finally getting a cohesive and comprehensive statewide strategy from the governor. So I think as we move to his roadmap to a new normal and move to his three-pronged approach and the 3 phases, that's going to be more of blanket coverage. I don't think from his language right now he's even going to break it down regionally. I think he's going to try to do a statewide blanket approach, and that's going to go a long way in those issues we've seen between counties. Now, I know a big concern, and this is for us even in county government, we have a few people commuting from out of state, but a lot of you guys probably have people living in South Carolina and in Tennessee. So that's a concern we're discussing. I know we talk about the high number of cases in Charlotte or the high number of cases in the Triangle, but Greenville, South Carolina has almost 700 cases, and they're closer than Charlotte. And we know Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee are aggressively opening up this week. So right for that, time's our best ally. We want to see as they reopen what if that has a direct impact on us in Western North Carolina. We want to see, even if it's not direct impact, we want to see internally to those states what their local trends look like as they reopen, and that will inform some of our decision making. And I'm sure the governor is watching as well, and that's going to shape some of his decision making.
700 cases in Greenville, huh?
About, yeah.
That's a little too close for comfort, huh?
Mm-hmm.
I know a question actually I got by email overnight had to do with meeting size. Callers in manufacturing have been super flexible and able to implement lots of creativity to keep production moving. But Amy just alluded to the fact that she had to do smaller group meetings to talk about policy. Can you give us any forecast on meeting size limitations that are currently in place, and do you see how that might be phasing through phase 1, 2, and 3?
Right. So the governor's guidance lately has been for public mass gatherings 10. In the county, we've been at 0 for no public mass gatherings. We're looking to relax that soon to match the governor's 10. The governor's intent from his phase 1 is to remain at 10. At phase 2, relax that, which we're assuming might be 50 or 100. And then phase 3, maybe 100 or 500. I don't foresee at any point this year maybe having gatherings of more than 500 people potentially. But I think a lot of manufacturing in both the local and state guidance was covered as essential business. Right. And we want you guys to cover that, limit gatherings, but you do have some flexibility as it's written right now in the states, the manufacturing clause, which is quite extensive.
And just because we're meeting in larger group sizes, we're still adhering to physical distance and facial covering. So, 6 feet, 10 minutes remains best practices throughout the summer.
Yeah, to the greatest extent possible. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm imagining one of the reasons we're having fewer questions in our chat is that this is a group that's been pretty creative in creating a number of these policies throughout the past 6 and 7 weeks. But I do want to give everyone the opportunity to throw any specific questions or comments into the chat function before we tie up. I'll also ask, in addition to your feedback on outstanding questions or resources you think you'd need, take a moment to share your feedback on this format. I know we're all zoomed out on calls, but when we do ask you to come together, particularly for important conversations like this around employee health, we want to make sure we're adding value. So would love your feedback on the call, the format, any other particular questions that you think would add great value to you that we should revisit specific to the manufacturing sector. And I'd also, going on to the last paragraph, the last slide there, Heather, draw your attention to a couple points of contact. The business@buncombecounty.org email address, always available for you should you have any questions that we weren't able to cover in this format. And then the second there, ashevillechamber.org/coronavirus. We have this week launched a second survey. You may recall we launched one the very first week of the health crisis. If you would, take a moment to answer that. What we have found is it's critically important information to give us kind of a real-time snapshot on the voice of business that gets fed directly to our decision and policymakers here locally, as well as our state delegation. So I really appreciate you clicking through and pursuing that survey for us. Fletch, do you have any closing thoughts for this group?
No, yeah, I did have a couple questions. One is we've gotten through our different communication channels, we've gotten a lot of questions from you guys, or maybe not you guys, but from manufacturing about our restrictions and how we're opening back up and what the phasing will look like. And from our point of view, from public health in the county, as we're reading those restrictions on manufacturing, they seem to be pretty minimal. Like in the governor's guidance and ours, there's pretty wide exemption for pretty much any, as we could tell, any phase of manufacturing. So I had a question for you guys about, do you see any prohibitions on on your end from our guidance or the state's guidance that we're just maybe not picking up on or not aware of? Or have your restrictions been more self-imposed, being proactive? And then if you guys want to put some responses into that, I saw another question about if someone's tested today and exposed tomorrow, why is testing so important? So I think when we talk about the greater, and Ellis, I'll ask you to chime in a minute too, but when we talk about the greater need for testing, and as the country moves back to a new normal, I think there seems to be this misconception that everybody only needs to be tested one time. Ideally, as we get the resources, people who haven't been exposed and we have capacity to tell if maybe people potentially have immunity or not, but people might be needing to be tested in the future on a routine basis, once a week, once every 2 weeks. It's not a one and done for testing. And the testing is important because as we start moving forward, if we can find somebody who is positive and isolate them and then quarantine all their contacts, their contact tracing, that covers so much ground for us as we try to contain the spread of it, as we're looking for a second wave in the fall. So testing is really important. That's why it's one of the 3 tenets that the Governor Cooper is looking for to reopen.
Very good to know. Fletch, thanks again. I know you've been running a marathon with us today, and have been since early March. Thank you for making all the time to talk with our business community yesterday, today, and throughout the week. You know, I'm confident that together we're more resilient through this thing, and I appreciate everyone joining in to make this call with us today. It's actually pretty great as someone who's been working primarily from home to see a bunch of familiar and friendly faces. So thank you for that. And thanks also to our partners in local government who are working hard to keep us safe and healthy, and to each of you that are working hard to protect payroll and valuable employment opportunities in our community. Together, those 2 things are going to see us through. So thanks for making time. Feel free to also reach out to me directly should you have any specific questions. cduncan@ashevillechamber.org. I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.